This episode of the AD History Podcast is brought to you by you, our amazing patron. Thank you for supporting the show and helping us create the AD history you deserve. We could not do it without you.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Powered by TGNR. Get your good news that's real news at TGNR by visiting tgnreview.com. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you via London and New York City, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. And how is everybody's favorite YouTube's #1 Leon Trotsky impersonator today?
I am a good, Paul. I'm very much in the festive season, as I'm sure the viewers can see by what I'm wearing at the moment. And as much as I look in the season, my voice might not sound as much in the season. As it's getting towards the end of the year, it only makes sense that my throat is just on the cusp of giving out of itself before I take some time off for the holiday. So if I sound a bit groggy and a bit deadpan, that's the reason why. But trust me, inside I'm super, super excited. Paul, how are you feeling?
I can't complain. Happy to be here today. And this is one of our favorite things to do, which of course is our mid-season break. Always necessary, especially this one, considering all the hard work and all the changes that have occurred in this time. Something that we most certainly do keep in mind here. And that, of course, is another edition of AD History Watches.
This is a long time coming, this one.
In so many ways. In so many ways is it a long time coming, because we are finally getting into, as you might imagine it would happen at one point, the year 2000 epic Gladiator. Ridley Scott, Russell Crowe, Joaquin Phoenix, a absolute beast of a movie.
It really is. It's one of those sort of era-defining films, isn't it? And something that struck me with this film, it's not something we really get too much anymore. And this film really sort of helps spur on a real movement at times, like those early 2000s epics. There were quite a few knocking around at that time in history. You had things like Troy, 300 was a bit later on, Master and Commander, even like the Pirates films, and like even Lord of the Rings to an extent. There was this really boom period in the early 2000s for like these big epic dramas that they don't really seem to exist too much anymore. I think they did a remake of Ben-Hur a few years back, and that did really poorly at the box office. There just isn't an interest for this kind of movie anymore, it seems. But in the early 2000s, it was. And Gladiator is seen as sort of something that really kickstarted that trend.
It was definitely landmark in its own way. And of course, one of the big reasons it's so landmark is what is now, for the most part, a lot of very dated looking CGI.
Yes. But impressive.
Even though it is, and it's also important to note, though, they did go a long way in terms of implementing practical effects.
Yeah, the film looks stunning, not accurate, and that's going to be something we're going to be saying a lot through this thing. Not accurate by any means,
Not a chance.
It looks amazing. And if you're watching this just as a popcorn munching movie fan, it's a great sort of epic flick. However, if you're going to watch this film and put your well actually hat, I like to say, like, well actually, and know the history behind it, this film falls flat on its ass, because some of the stuff it does, some of the stuff it tries to get away with is astounding. At least I thought so anyway.
It's overwhelming,
to
say the least. There's so much to it. And I want to get to this conversation, but you look like you got something to say.
I was going to say, so you'd seen this film before, hadn't you? Yeah.
Oh, many times.
Yeah, this is my first.
I remember seeing it in theater.
Gosh, so this was my first viewing, so I would have been about 5 or 6.
This was your first viewing?
I know the highlights. I'd seen it on the background. So I was about 5 or 6 when this film first came out. So I wouldn't have seen it at the cinema, but I knew, like, the big bits, but I'd never actually sort of properly sat down and watched it in one go. I say in one go, I watched this over multiple sittings, because I watched the extended edition, Paul. When I do something, I don't do half measures. So if I mention things you or the viewers don't know, that's the reason why I watched the big 3-hour extended version of this film, because I'm a maniac. But no, it was very interesting watching this for the first time.
I mean, just in its normal theatrical cut, it's still an incredibly large movie.
Yeah.
But we're going to get into the meat and bones of this movie in just a moment. But with all of that in mind and all of it out of the way, it is time to lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast Ground Rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4. History and the past is like a different country. Okay, Mr. Foote. We start, I think you kind of have to start off by saying here
Okay.
that this is a historical film insofar as there was somebody that was the Emperor of Rome that was named Marcus Aurelius, that there was somebody that was an Emperor of Rome whose name was Commodus, and there were gladiatorial battles fought in Rome.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's kind of where it ends.
I was shocked. So, spoilers for this 21-year-old film, guys. I was shocked.
Seriously, if you haven't seen it at this point, shame on you. Shame on you.
I was shocked at how much this went away from the history, because we know historical fiction. Historical fiction is a great thing, and historical fiction normally involves making up scenarios and characters, but these scenarios and characters fit into the grand actual history. They don't really ever affect the events, and that's where we get to the era of like speculative history sort of fiction. Your things like your Man in High Castle, even
that's alternate history.
And even things like Inglourious Bastards, where Hitler meets his demise in quite a different way. This film,
yeah, you could say that.
This film goes into alternate history in my eyes. I was shocked by the end. Like this,
it's an interesting way to think about it.
I was, unless I'm misremembering the actual history, I was shocked about how this film went, especially towards the end. But it starts off somewhat accurately. So, like many sort of epic films, a Gladiator introduces us with a text scroll. It's not even a scroll, just some text on the screen explaining
what the hell is going on.
What the hell is going on, indeed. And it introduces us to 180 AD and barbarian wars. And from what I could gather, this actually happened. There were barbarian wars in 180 AD.
Yeah.
And it says that Rome was at its grandest, its most magnificent, and that was true. But 180 AD is very much like the end of that golden period. It's a really interesting time to set a film about Rome in, because when you want to talk about Rome, you want to talk about the empire, the glory. This is literally just as things are about to go downhill. This is right on the end of the Pax Romana. If you look at most sources agree that the Pax Romana, the Golden Age, whatever you want to call it, ended in 180 AD. So it was a really interesting era of Roman history to pick.
Yeah, so in this case, Marcus Aurelius, and we've talked about Marcus Aurelius before in Commodus, albeit it was about 11 months ago. But...
Yeah, so everything we cover in this episode, in this review of the film, Gladiator review, if you want to call it that, we've covered in the actual history in previous AD history episodes. So that really helps out as well.
It does. So in this case, the actual Marcus Aurelius died right around modern-day Vienna in about 180 AD, and it's largely thought that he probably passed from Antonine Plague. And in this case, one thing that is roughly consistent with history is that he was essentially on campaign with the army fighting the Marcomanni, one of those main Germanic tribes that they were fighting at the time. And, of course, Commodus most certainly does not murder his father.
No.
There is no talk about a succession struggle for one very simple reason. Commodus can't be kept from power because Commodus is already in power. They're co-emperors.
And something I found absolutely shocking was this whole Marcus Aurelius was like, I don't want Commodus to be emperor. I want you, Maximus, to be kind of like emperor. It was this whole, I want to restore Rome back to a republic. Like,
which is total bollocks, by the way.
That was my jaw dropped when I heard that. I was like, this dude, like this, he was a great emperor, but he was the last of the 5 good emperors. He was the exact opposite. He was more emperor than previous ones. He literally gave the throne, and he was the most traditional of emperors we'd had for 5 years, because he literally gave the throne to his son, his actual non-adopted birth son.
Yeah,
he was about as far away from Republic sentimentalities as you could be.
I think where they were kind of trying to draw from in this case is the fact that Marcus had notably a very good, cordial, and productive relationship with the Senate.
Yeah.
But there is nothing to suggest whatsoever that he was looking to go back to the Republican form of Rome. At this point, the Republic has not existed for almost, if not 2 centuries, maybe even slightly longer than that. That would be a huge freaking jump to be able to try to accommodate, to the point in which it is abjectly silly. On top of the fact, once again, Commodus is already in power, and he prepared him for that.
Yeah, and I was just so shocked by it. But I'd love to talk a little bit about this opening battle scene, because
there's a lot to say there.
Yeah, and we don't know how accurate it is, but it's great to see a Roman battle with our own eyes. We often just sort of talk about war. So we often say in this podcast, and then there was a war and this happened, but to actually see that blood and guts, that very messy affair of Roman battle with our own eyes, was interesting. I found a really fun fact about this opening battle in the forest. This was shot in Surrey in southeast England. And this woods they found was due to be cleared anyway. It was due to be deforested. So Ridley Scott convinced them to, hey, can we film here and burn the forest down for you guys?
For you, yeah, I heard about that story. That was really cool.
That's a really cool little story, I thought, with that. And I did thoroughly quite enjoy this opening battle scene. It was great to see Rome in all its blood and guts and glory, really, to see that sort of fighting taking place before our eyes.
It is, and it's interesting to think, and I'm not going to even pretend to take credit for this part, because it's just part of the research that I did, but the presentation of, effectively, we'll call them the Marcomanni, or the Germanic tribes, or Germania, if you will, for this case, is a portrayal that definitely shows the lasting staying power of the Roman perception and the Roman propaganda machine in terms of how they visualize these barbarian enemies that they were fighting. They look like they were straight. They could have been Neanderthals.
Yeah, they could have been like from Beyond the Wall in Game of Thrones, couldn't they? Like, it's just that classic.
Oh
idea
yeah, it's
of
right. It's right there.
Yeah,
it's that bad.
Yeah, and they weren't really like that, obviously, but that's just how he said the Roman propaganda, even to this day. When
it's right there, man.
When we imagine Rome fighting Germanic tribes, we imagine them fighting like long-haired, big beards, no shirts, that sort of thing. And
the movie does not disappoint.
No, the movie doesn't disappoint. But I guess that's kind of the point of this movie. This movie is meant to. It's very much. If you were to ask people, films set in ancient Rome, this will be number one. Like, and it's very much supposed to lean into our perception of Rome, kind of like how, in the same way, kind of about history, Jurassic Park. Like, there's that big argument. Oh, they didn't actually have dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't actually have scales; they had feathers. No, but that's not the perception of them. Like, our perception, like, what we want to see is scaled big lizards. We don't want to see big chickens. When people want to see Rome on the big screen, this is what they want to see. And it's not historically accurate, but it's kind of the public perception of Rome. And Ridley Scott didn't want to stray away from that.
No, Ridley Scott is really interesting, because earlier you mentioned The Man in the High Castle, and I believe, at least for the first couple of seasons of that, he was an executive producer of that. Now he has he has something of a reputation for sticking his name in places at times where he might not be that involved. But there was definitely one commonality that I noticed between those two. And I'm going to say it for the record. I loved the first 2 seasons of The Man of High Castle, especially the first. And the last 2 were hot garbage.
I still need to watch it. I know about it, but I need to watch or read the audio or read the book. I need to get it on that because I've heard
the book and the TV series are two entirely. They deviate in some very significant ways.
Interesting.
But not talking about Man in the High Castle here, even though I could get on that soapbox. Any case, so Ridley Scott is really well known for being a director, especially that it is very much a show don't tell. Yeah. And there's a lot of symbolism in that. And one of the very first things that we see early on in this battle is what looks like a dog, but could very easily pass as a wolf, which is, right off the bat, a clear symbolism.
Yeah.
The wolf is Rome.
The wolf is always, yeah.
Yeah, the wolf is Rome, without a doubt. And you also learn a lot about Maximus as well.
Hey, good old Maximus, who didn't exist.
No. I mean, I think there were some kind of like general inspirations for him, but he's not a historic figure by any means.
So two of the main ones that came to mind for me is Spartacus, obviously, sort of slave rebellion within Rome, that sort of thing. But another huge one, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, Cincinnatus, and
I was gonna bring up Cincinnatus. Yeah,
it's literally the whole I'm going to go back to my farm. Maximus.
Yep.
When we first meet Maximus, he's this general in the war, and they're saying, "What are you going to do once it's over?" He's like, "I'm going to return to my farm, to my wife and son."
And Cincinnatus was like one of the great noble figures that are known from the Republican era of Rome. Just going, leaving the farm behind, serving the state, and when they're done, I'm going to go back to tilling my fields.
Yeah, and Maximus is clearly very much of the same ilk as that. Russell Crowe.
There's also a little bit of Trajan in there as well.
Yeah.
Trajan's also a Spaniard on top of that and a really, very successful general.
Well, speaking of Spaniards, how convincing is Russell Crowe as being a Spaniard?
Yeah, not at all.
It's so like, the Hispanic one. Oh yeah, Russell Crowe, that big, bulky white dude over there, like... Who's he trying to fool there? But each to their own. I just found that really funny. Every time Russell Crowe is referred to as a Spaniard, like my perception of what someone from Spain potentially looks like isn't Russell Crowe, but I just find that very
definitely
funny.
Not.
No, and it's so something else that sort of I realized during this opening scene of the film. Strength and honor. This is a phrase used throughout the film, and I did some digging into it. I couldn't figure out if it was an actual Roman term. Some sources said it was, some sources said it wasn't. If you know anything more about that, Paul, that'd be great.
It generally kind of fits. It's certainly not inappropriate. I mean, that's very much some of the very important core virtues, naturally, of Maximus in particular. But the thing I like about Maximus in particular, specifically in the show don't tell way and in the human way, is that Ridley Scott goes a long way to wanting to show Maximus as being truly a soldier's general, a general who fights leading from the front. He's not this, this theory-driven tactician that's sitting well behind the lines. He's there, he's fighting the enemy army, he's going through the same hardships, and he doesn't even really talk that much. He leads from pure example. And the strength of that example. And you can tell that, certainly within the context of the film, that he is not just love for it, but their dedication to him is absolutely apparent. How could you not follow that guy, through the flames of hell?
No, he is a good character. He's a very much an entry point into this world, a very everyman. Even in the way you mentioned, he doesn't talk that much. I said this was my first viewing of it, and I know Russell Crowe won Best Actor in the Oscars that year for this performance. So I was expecting quite a hammy performance, quite a big epic speeches, that sort of thing. But it really isn't. It's quite a subdued role, and he did perform it well.
Yeah, he was also apparently a big pain in the rear end on set.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Especially as far as the script is concerned.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Apparently, he was something of a diva, but it worked. I mean, there's no question that he pulled it off incredibly well.
And speaking of actors in this film, he is played by the original Dumbledore, Richard Harris. So this
Yep.
must have been one of his final performances alongside Dumbledore.
I believe it was. I believe so.
Yeah, and he's good enough in it. But as we mentioned, I think off camera,
He looks like he literally looks like the ideal philosopher king. And we said this back in the episode when we were talking about Commodus, the ideal philosopher king that Plato talked about in every way.
He was not that old, He was not that old, however, by any means. No.
He was in his mid to late 50s. He wasn't in his early 70s.
He died at 58, and Richard Harris's Aurelius does not look 58 in this film. But then...
No, he's 70 and he looks it.
And then once we have Aurelius, we also have his son, Commodus. How do you feel about Joaquin Phoenix's performance in this film as Commodus? Because you were the one who gave us a good look at Commodus in that episode of AD History, so you know the figure pretty well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this performance of him, because it's become the definitive Commodus for so many people.
It's interesting because in a few very specific ways. Well, one is this Commodus is dealing with some kind of succession struggle, which of course did not happen. There's no question that I think he was in power for about 12 years, as I recall. He really didn't have that much of an appetite for the actual business and administrative duties behind ruling. And he was really into the games. He fought in the games in all sorts of different ways. And even by hostile sources, like say Cassius Dio, for example, he even gives him credit where due is there. The thing about this particular depiction of Commodus by Joaquin Phoenix is there are certain things that are much more scandalous to a modern audience than they might have been to the ancient audience. Like, for example,
I know it's good.
Making advances on his biological sister. Especially to a modern audience, that is something that is considered out of bounds in the extreme, to say nothing of...
And conversely, to a modern audience, and while we are modern people, we're very well versed in the world of ancient Rome.
We're certainly not postmodern.
No. And when
your mama's so old, she's postmodern.
When he started to make those advances, I didn't bat an eyelid. I don't think that was the reception Ridley Scott was intending on, but I was like, yeah, this is ancient Rome. Of course he's going to hit on his sister. Why should I be shocked by this? Like, that was something, it was something that did not faze me at all. But as you said, we are very much ancient historians, at least to some degree anyway. So far we are. I wasn't shocked to see that because we know that sort of thing happened in ancient Rome.
Absolutely. So the Romans would not have been quite as put off by it as, say, most of the people that were in the theater and still watch it today.
Yeah. And speaking of that sister, so she's on site as well. Yes, she is on site as well. And she's talking with Aurelius, and he says, oh, if only you had been born a man. And that's just a great encapsulation of Rome's opinion on women at the time, I suppose. You couldn't really get a female emperor, even if they were born, even through birth, that sort of thing.
But there's another thing I would add about Commodus and his portrayal here.
Okay, yes.
Is that in reality, that portrayal of Commodus wasn't just Commodus, from the History Augusta, or in the case of Cassius Dio's 80-volume History of Rome or whatever it was. It was Commodus, but it was also Caligula. It was Nero. It was Domitian. Kind of all of these misfits from the last, almost 200 years of empire, all kind of balled up into this one fictional portrayal of one Commodus.
In many ways, this film is really like a greatest hits of Rome. Like all the tropes you'd expect.
Yes.
Like I said, all the tropes you'd expect to see in a film about Rome, they're here in one way or another. You've got your wars, you've got your mad emperor, you've got your gladiators. Like I said, really, he just wanted to make like the definitive Roman film. And in some ways, that's a success, I would say, at least from a cinematic point of view.
Certainly. And it's interesting when we get past the battle scene and you get into the whole beginning of the succession struggle. One is obviously Marcus Aurelius could not fit that mold better. Both of his actual children are in their own ways, kind of pieces of work.
Yeah.
And for some reason, though, it is stated very clearly in the film that the first time that Maximus ever actually travels to and sees Rome is when he's a slave and is a gladiator. I don't fully comprehend exactly how the relationship materialized so many years earlier with Lucilla.
Yeah, that's a that's a very good plot hole, actually. He's never been to Rome. We can only presume Lucilla has spent an awful lot of time in Rome. So yeah, that is a very good point you've made there, boy. That's something I didn't notice. As you said, you watched this quite a few times before researching. And
Yeah.
it's only once you start to watch film that many times, you start to notice those strange plot holes. No, that's a really good point.
And so naturally, you get to the point where Commodus finds out what's happening. He kills his dad. And then he takes what in some respects actually is a very logical decision at that place in time, which is to get rid of the guy that could derail your whole effort. You know, within the confines of the plot. We get to a point where he tries to execute him, he fails. And then he has to travel from basically modern-day Vienna to somewhere on the Iberian Peninsula on horseback.
It's a big old journey.
It is an incredibly long journey. You have to get through the Alps, then you have to get through effectively southern France, then you have to get through the Pyrenees, and then wherever it is you're going on the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah.
And the thing that surprises me is not even so much that he's making the trip or the realities of it, but that Commodus somehow managed to get word out ahead of him to execute his family.
Yeah, some strange loopholes there, that sort of thing. Like how, because
you're not supposed to think about it.
No, and that like everyone's going at the same speed at that sort of time in history. Like it's either horse or walk, basically. So like hard to get the head start, really.
This is undeniably true, without a doubt. So
what do you think of Ridley Scott as a director? Because I think he's really hit and miss.
He's very hit or miss. I mean, you have something like this, or you have something like Blade Runner, and they're classics. Blade Runner is obviously a much better movie. The original one, that is, a much better movie than Gladiator, especially because it is just outright fiction, science fiction. It's the future for all intents and purposes. I do find it interesting, though, based on when that movie was made, that there was always this idea how the Japanese economic bubble wouldn't somehow burst at some point in time.
Yeah.
So it was very much of the 80s, as it were. I always found that funny the first time I saw it. But, he's very good with the visuals. He's very good with the visuals. He definitely, in many ways, is a master of show, don't tell, which to me is the most powerful form of visual storytelling. If you have to tell the audience and not show them, you're not doing your job right.
Exactly. If I had to be told things, I'd read a book, that sort of thing. That show me you use the screen. Oh, that's interesting to hear. I think.
Here's a really good example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. You've seen the very first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, Episode 4.
I have seen Star Wars, yes.
And other than that opening title crawl, for about the first minute of the movie, everything you need to know, is depicted in visuals alone. I love that kind of storytelling in films. And so for this, he gets a lot of symbolism in there. There's a lot of really intense images. And the whole thing about walking along that field of grain from the very beginning is telling you that this man, Maximus, is not long for this world. No. He has one last mission as a soldier to fulfill before he can finally find peace.
And that was a great sort of analogy of this film, analysis of the film right there. Yeah, that walking amongst the grain, that's a reoccurring theme, an image even we get throughout the film, and it's to represent the afterlife. Is it Elysium, I believe is the term I'm looking for? Is that the Roman afterlife?
He's right. Yeah, he even mentions it when he gives that little brief pep talk.
Yeah.
Which is not nearly as long as you think it would be.
No, but that kind of once again leads into how this is quite a subtle role. I went into this expecting it to be a big epic speeches, but it's very sort of subtle little things like that. And eventually, so when he does arrive at his home, he does find his wife and son crucified and burned. And then from there, he ends up back in slavery. Is it in somewhere? It's in North Africa he ends up.
They say it's Morocco.
Morocco, yeah. And it was filmed, a lot of this film. So I don't think any of this film was filmed in Rome itself. I believe it's three main filming locations were Morocco, the UK, as I mentioned, and of course, Malta, which is a place near and dear to my heart, that tiny little island
Yes,
being
indeed.
with Maltese heritage. That was the three main filming locations for this film. And I think Morocco took up a big chunk of that.
So the scenes, the very few of them that is, that are supposed to take place in Spain or Spania, those are all filmed in Tuscany.
Oh, okay then. Interesting.
Those are filmed in Tuscany. So yeah, basically he finds them crucified, which is also something that for a modern audience would mean a lot.
Yeah.
Just as this truly brutal form of execution. And on top of that, and this is probably where the other inaccuracy comes in here, is that because Maximus, being a general, of course, he has Roman citizenship. And that would mean that his wife and his son would ultimately be kind of protected in the same way. And even if you wanted to bump somebody off, for the most part, as I've always understood it, crucifixion was reserved for the capital punishment of anybody except Roman citizens. You could be executed if you're a Roman citizen. They did that all the time, but they wouldn't crucify you.
I wonder, so 180 AD we're in or so. It'd be interesting to know where Christianity was at this point, because this is 180 or just shy of 180 years since Jesus was on the planet. Of course, to us today, crucifixion and the cross is a deeply religious symbol. But of course, initially it was just a form of execution. So I wonder if it had that religious imagery surrounding it. And even to us, the audience, we've already talked about an afterlife, Elysium, and seeing sort of crucifixion. It's very strong religious imagery being shown to us in this film. And it has got that kind of sort of holy undertone to it. We see that sort of that constant image of a Maximus sort of being lifted off the ground, being transported like that, which we're going to see in a moment as he's being transported into slavery. But it's
that's the other distance issue here.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so you picked him up somewhere in Spain.
Yeah.
You got him across the Straits of Gibraltar, and now he's being sold off in Morocco.
Yeah, or Numidia, as Morocco was called at the time.
I believe you're right.
Yeah,
yes.
and something this film is actually really quite good at accurate with is names. So Rome, I always find it interesting how similar and different the names Rome used for Europe are as the names we use. Europe and North Africa as well, of course, because a lot of them are strikingly accurate. Like you have Germania, which we still use, Germany, Britannia,
and they would have pronounced it Germania.
Germania, apologies. Britannia. There's still some very similar names. However, there's a lot of names that don't really exist on our maps anymore. And Numidia is a great example of that. That sort of area of North Africa. What else is there? Gaul as well as a prime example. We don't use Gaul for France anymore. Numidia is another
usually, unless you're talking about Charles de Gaulle.
Exactly, unless you're talking about Charles de Gaulle, exactly.
I love how Andrew Roberts put it. That sounds more like a nom de guerre than a baptismal reality.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
But we're not going down the Charles de Gaulle.
No. But it's just cool to see them referring to it as Numidia, that sort of thing. One of the things this film does correctly, which I'm very happy about, of course, is the names.
Names are your business.
And it's like around here, we kind of get introduced to the world of the Gladiator. Russell Crowe's Maximus, he's in a pretty sort of beat up way now. We see he's got those horrible wounds, that sort of thing. And he's sort of into slavery. And just there's a great little cameo here from a comedian. He's the slave owner who ends up with Maximus. A comedian
called Proximo.
Is that Oliver Reed's character?
Yeah, and I believe this was also Oliver Reed's last role.
He died during the filming of this film. So the guy Proximo buys Maximus from is comedian Omid Jalili, who's a sort of stand-up comedian here in the UK. He's in the Mummy film as well, the first Mummy film. So the early 2000s, clearly the late 90s, early 2000s was his heyday because he hasn't really done much.
It was very good to him.
He hasn't done much in the world of film since then. He's remained a popular British comedian, but just fun little cameo scene him here as well. But no, Proximo, as you mentioned, that's Oliver Reed's final role. He died. You know about the famous CGI recreation of him in this film?
Was it during his death sequence? When eventually Maximus says to him, "Are you starting to turn into a good man?"
It's when he's given him the keys. It's when he's given Maximus. Yeah. That scene, and it's very good for 2000, but it's very good for 2000. I'll say.
And that's saying a lot.
Yeah,
because we still haven't quite mastered, even with deep fakes. We still haven't quite gotten it.
No,
I mean, you look at the recreation of Luke Skywalker in the finale of season 2 of The Mandalorian, and there was a lot of criticism of that, despite the fact everybody was excited as hell. But no, I was not familiar with that with Oliver Reed.
Oh no, there's even the strange Grand Moff Tarkin, isn't there, in Rogue One?
Oh yeah, Rogue One. Yeah, that one is Uncanny Valley territory.
Yeah, that's a strange.
And this was no Uncanny Valley territory.
No, something worth mentioning there. Yeah, so 2 famous British people there, Oliver Reed and Omid Jalili at the same time, but. This is quite an accurate portrayal of the life of a gladiator. They were slaves forced to fight. They weren't these noble warriors. When you think like fighters of Rome, maybe think like it might be easy to get something like a centurion and a gladiator someone mixed up. But gladiators weren't noblemen, or they weren't like knights of shining armor. They were rough slaves, or forced to do these horrible things. And they didn't fight for war. They just fought for their own amusement. They were very much the modern wrestler.
Not until Marcus Aurelius began to realize, hey, these guys might be really helpful in my army.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. I guess not until then. Yeah.
He started pulling in gladiators during his time, which, as I understand it, based on the research that I have done, just made it more expensive to put on quality games.
Yeah, because you're losing all your good gladiators to the actual wars.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the sequence here, right? With when he finally is just kind of like floating and he's in North Africa. That's of course when he makes his first ally and friend.
Yes,
in the person of Juba.
Juba, that's the name. The actor Digimon Hudson, I believe he's called.
You might be right. I'm not 100%.
He's a really good actor.
I've definitely seen him before.
He's one of the main characters in Blood Diamond.
I have not watched Blood Diamond.
Blood Diamond. Well, that's another film we could maybe watch at some point. That's kind of historical. But and he's also in the Guardian of the Galaxy films. He's in the first one anyway, if you're a big Marvel nerd like myself. But he's a really great actor. He's great in this as well. Yeah,
he is. In many ways, he represents the best qualities of Maximus: the love of home, the love of family, a truly honorable and decent person, despite what he's going to be asked to do.
Yeah, and they make a great team together when Maximus, they finally entered the first gladiatorial combat, and like they're tied together, and that was really interesting. One had a sword, one had a shield. And I found that to be...
They were hand in glove.
And I really enjoy the action of this film. I think it's got some really good visceral... I mean, I'm a big... I'm a big Marvel nerd. And as much as I love the Marvel films, the action of them is so rubbery. It's just punches and like... To see like swords proper going in and like... It was just great to see some real rough action like that. It was refreshing.
People are getting jacked up. Let's put it that way.
There's heads coming off at one point. There's limbs.
Yeah,
there's all kinds of interesting stuff. If you're into stuff like that, this is your film.
And it's also something where we begin learning more about Maximus as well, which is to say, and he says this as much, but after having it been shown very clearly, he only kills when he has to.
Yeah. And unfortunately, in gladiatorial combat, he kind of pushes into that corner to kill.
Yes, but he finds ways out of it at times. One of which, obviously, later in the film, is by winning over the crowd. Naturally, that's part of it. But it shows a certain honor to his character, a very specific decency, that killing may be what he needs to do, but he will never do it any further than he deems it necessary in order to fulfill his mission in the long run. And of course, he's a gladiator now. He's a slave. And Rome has a very strange relationship with gladiators, which is to say that they were the rock stars of their times. You know, they were the NFL players. They were the star Major League Baseball players, NBA players, or Premier League soccer.
Or pro wrestlers, I feel, is quite apt comparison.
Yes, but I also consider that a combination of incredible athleticism and coordination with the ability to act.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that sometime.
One day.
At some point, we will. But they have a strange relationship because they become the rock stars of their time. They're the huge celebrities, but at the same time, they're still slaves.
Yeah.
They're not in control of their own destiny.
It is really interesting. I think perhaps a more apt comparison might even be racing horses or even greyhounds.
Oh, that's dark.
Like,
And that's probably accurate too.
It probably is. Like these horses, there's some incredibly
horses, especially.
Yeah, there's some incredibly celebrated horses. Sure. Yeah, there's but these horses aren't. They might enjoy racing. I'm not sure, but I think that's a more apt comparison. Like, they're famous and beloved, but what have they got to show for it?
And the answer is not a hell of a lot. Even though as gladiators succeed, their conditions, I imagine, do improve some. But it's interesting because we also learn the introduction of Proxima. So Oliver Reed's character is a real misdirection, because you think that he's just become this super callous, hard individual that just looks at this as transactions.
Yeah.
And making a buck, which it is. But you find out not too long afterwards that there's another side of the man, another side of the man that, based upon his introduction and that incredible little monologue he gives you, well, your mother may have been there when she, basically gave birth to you, screaming into this world, I'm going to be here when you meet your end.
Yeah. He's good in there. He's Oliver Reed lived a very wild lifestyle. And he's terrific in this film. He's absolutely great. I think everyone was quite impressed by the kind of acting he pulled out for this one.
Oh yeah, I mean, talk about putting on a final performance here. But you find out when he gets into this conversation with Maximus after this first bout that there's more going on there with him.
Yeah, he sort of reveals that he was a former gladiator himself, and to reach that age while being a gladiator is no small feat. So he's clearly someone who's worth listening to, I suppose. And it ultimately leads to the two of them, and of course many others, his other gladiators, going to Rome. And this is where we and Maximus first see Rome for the first time. And Paul, what are your thoughts on this depiction of the actual city of Rome?
From more informed sources, as I understand it, if you begin really looking into the details of it, apparently there are some definite inaccuracies.
Just a few.
Yeah, I remember one source reading that if you pinpoint it, apparently you can see some like church spires. So naturally they weren't going for the whole 9 yards here.
No, and even things like the statues. So we know that the statues were painted in ancient Rome. We still have some statues.
They were totally colorful.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been much. Like, we have this idea, like I said, kind of like the whole how dinosaurs in Jurassic Park have scales because that's what the audience think they look like. The public audience presume Rome was beige and sandy. So that's kind of what we give them, even though that's not historically accurate. Like, Rome would have been
even though I think I like it better the way it looks now personally. But that could just be preference. And there's another thing, speaking about writing a script and portraying it for the benefit of a modern audience, you'll notice that all the characters, especially when they get to Rome, they keep referring to the Colosseum as the Colosseum.
Yes, that's something I noticed as well. Like, they probably wouldn't have called it the Colosseum. It was called something like... It was named after the amphitheater. It had
or the Colossus.
It was named after who, I can't remember who was emperor at the time. It was like known as so and so's Colosseum. I did a whole a segment about
the Flavian Amphitheater.
Flavian, that's the one. Yes.
Yeah, Flavian, because it was the Flavian dynasty.
Yes, yeah.
That came about and was important to that. And of course, there is that what was originally commissioned and was a Colossus statue of Nero, which had been converted. So usually they'd either call it the amphitheater, the Flavian Amphitheater, or the Colossus.
And we see its feet, don't we? Quite often in this film. Then aren't they paddling around by the Colossus's feet?
They are indeed. I think that actually may be the only portion that actually remains today.
Yeah. I should remember. I've been there.
I'll
say yes, but I should remember because I have been there.
The greatest example of this in terms of how it's been referred to, the Colosseum, the way I think of it is today, if I were going to a Yankee game at Yankee Stadium, you'd say, I'm going to Yankee Stadium, but it's more likely, especially if you're talking to another baseball fan from the area, we just call it the stadium.
Yeah.
It's just the stadium.
That's the only stadium. Yeah, and that makes sense. But I was even impressed that they actually completely restructured it, because obviously the Colosseum famously these days is a huge chunk missing from the side of it. And the portrayal of Rome this film was heading for. Part of me was, are they even going to remember to put that back in? But no, they did. We see what Ridley Scott presumed the Colosseum would have looked like in its full glory.
And it's interesting because apparently they spent many millions of dollars in recreating a whole slice of the Colosseum for the benefit of shooting this movie.
Wow.
And they filled the rest of it in with CGI. They had some, physical human extras in there. They had some CGI crowd members. And apparently, and interestingly enough, though not at all surprising, they also used some cardboard cutouts.
For far away shots, I think they probably still do that to this day on things. Like, it's a pretty, it's a pretty regular thing. It's an easy little bit of Hollywood magic, if you want to call it that. Cardboard cutouts serve very well. When you got them mixed up with other people in far away shots, you can't really beat them.
No, you can't. And I'm a big fan of practical effects.
Same.
I've kind of gotten overwhelmed by all the ones and zeros at times when it comes to the CGI that's being employed today. Amazing as it is, but the human eye still has an incredible ability to identify what I can only define as fakeness, if I were to call it anything, right? But they did a really fantastic job here. And also something else that's really interesting to point out is they even put the canopy that went around the top, which was debated about for a long time. In terms of, did they actually use it? What was it specifically used for? Was it definitely for cooling? Those are interesting questions to ask. But what's interesting here is when we finally get to the point where they're in Rome, and you're seeing a lot of these interesting dealings. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Commodus and his relationship with the Senate as it's portrayed there. And it is very clear, I'm sure we mentioned it when we were talking about Commodus in that episode from back in January, February 2021, so earlier this year relative to the time of recording this episode, is that it wasn't very good.
No.
And a lot of the sources are naturally not big homers for Commodus. The History Augusta, to use a certain term to a certain extent, I mean, it has value, but to some extent it's a tabloid.
That's a great way to explain
news.
It is a tabloid. Yeah,
fake news.
It's very trashy. It's very,
Yeah. You also have another history by a historian writer called Herodian. And, of course, you have one Cassius Dio, who, when the time of Commodus comes, and he's writing his 80-something volume history that's, cradle to grave of Rome for when he was alive and doing it, when you start getting into the areas of the rule of Marcus Aurelius and then Commodus, of course, Cassius Dio, and he makes this very clear, is then writing that history from firsthand experience, which is important to note as well. And so they did not have a great relationship. And you can see that they don't, not because they're necessarily outwardly hostile, but they're more jeering him. They're not respectful. They do not believe that he is up to the job that he is been bestowed with. And to some extent, you can understand why, because if you're an emperor, he becomes obviously very, very consumed by the whole Maximus deal, despite the fact that for all intents and purposes, he should be holding all the cards.
Yeah, but he isn't quite, and he doesn't know it's Maximus to begin with, does he? He watches Maximus battle for the first time in the Colosseum.
And he doesn't realize, of course, that it's him until he goes down there and chooses to meet him.
Yeah.
And so you're looking also at a lot of the political intrigue. There was a Senator Gracchus, I believe.
Yes.
In fact, I think it might have been a couple of them.
It's Derek Jacobi's character in this film.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one that wanted to basically allow the coup against Commodus to go forward.
And there's that great scene between him and some others, and it's very Game of Thrones. It's almost like they're all sort of scheming behind the Emperor's back, and that once again reminded me a lot of Game of Thrones sort of things going on there. And
I haven't seen a ton of Game of Thrones.
Oh, have you
but
not?
No, my wife has. She's been really into it. I figure I'll go and do it at some point because it's just so culturally relevant. But from what I have seen of Game of Thrones, even those scenes in particular were shot in a very similar way.
They are very shot in very much a similar way. I wouldn't be surprised if this film was did help set the tone for how Game of Thrones would be shot and produced. Just going back a little bit, just when we first get introduced to Rome and the Colosseum, there are some interesting quotes I picked up on. So I've forgotten his name again. Maximus's friend. He says, "I didn't know men could build such things," and I found this to be really interesting, as we believe he is from sort of sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa.
I kind of assume that he was probably somewhere from Northwest Africa,
Yeah.
maybe like what we consider today, perhaps like the Gold Coast or Ivory Coast,
Yeah.
maybe. But
And
they don't spell that out.
No, and I just think this thing was interesting. So I didn't know men could build such things, because as we know, human development varied greatly across the world, from Europe compared to Africa, compared to what's happening in Asia, compared to what was happening in the Americas at the time. And it just showed that sort of different reflection of different cultures. He wouldn't have ever seen a building like that, because from where he came from, that wasn't happening yet. And it just showed, I guess, some respect to the history.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense. And the Colosseum, what we call the Colosseum today, is still a wonder.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Which, of course, speaks to just the wonder that is expressed in that statement and in that scene. So,
and one other thing I found of interest, I can't remember who said it, but someone mentions a plague in the Greek quarter of Rome.
We're talking about Antonine Plague, undoubtedly.
Yes, yeah. And this really reminded me of, do you remember when we talked about Juvenal, the satirist?
Of course.
And he had that, his most famous work was about leaving Rome because it was gross and full of Greek people. It just reminded me of that, like that sort of real commoner perspective of Rome that we don't really get too often in the history books, because history is written by stuffy old men, more or less, talking about other stuffy old men. We don't really get a look at what was going on with plebeian life in Rome.
It's harder to get the bottom-up perspective in ancient history. It's not impossible,
no, but
it's certainly difficult, and not nearly as much attention is often paid to it, to be sure. And so, yeah, there was indeed a Greek quarter in ancient Rome, which is interesting to say the least. And it also speaks to the fact that, you know, we look at Rome today as this very monolithic thing. But of course, it was a multi-ethnic empire. And a place like Rome, though obviously with strong Greek and Latin influence, is still very cosmopolitan. It draws people from everywhere.
Yeah, it does. It was a city. It was like in the same way London or New York are cities. People go there to do something from all across the world, all across the empire at this time. It would have had Greek people. It would have had like people from sort of North Africa, I suppose. And that was something
definitely
I thought was very interesting. And it's easy to poke fun at the accents. See, you get every kind of accent in this film, minus, I guess, an actual Italian accent. And it's easy to poke fun of that. But I think it's worth mentioning because that is somewhat reminiscent to what Rome would have been like at that time. There would have been different voices, different languages, different ethnicities all throughout the city. It wasn't just Roman speaking Latin in there. It would have been a huge mix.
Yeah, basically, if your empire stretches from Newcastle to effectively Baghdad, that's a lot of different people inside your borders.
Yeah.
And Rome, you know, there was definitely money to be made there. Without a doubt, in addition to other places, of course. But definitely money to be made there. And, of course, it's going to attract people from all over. It's the eternal city.
Yeah.
It has not fallen out in the way that it has in terms of where we currently are in the proper show.
No, definitely not. No, by now in our actual AD history, Rome's very out of fashion. And it's quite shocking. It's hard to realize that at times. But no, Rome's out. But as we sort of carry on through the film, so we get to Commodus realizing Maximus is still alive, and
what a scene that is!
It's a really good scene.
When he turns his back on him, then comes back around, takes off the helmet. You know, I am Maximus. You know, father of a slain son, husband to a murdered wife, and the true and dear friend of the true emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, and I shall have my vengeance in this life or the next, which is a line that actually Russell Crowe hated. He
It's
hated
a pretty
it,
good
and
line.
I thought it worked really well within the context of the film and the emotional current of it all. And so, but apparently he hated it, and the only reason it stayed in is because he couldn't think of a better line.
It's amazing Russell Crowe had such say in the script. Like, just you're an
He
actor,
was one of the
say
biggest
the
actors
lines.
on Earth at the time.
I guess so. Yeah, and he's still a pretty big actor to this day. But very interesting when you, like you said, that there are quite a few stories about Russell Crowe out there. He seems a very interesting figure. I'll say that.
To say the least. One thing that I've always kind of operated on, this is just a little bit of a tangent, is that for the most part, whether it be celebrities in entertainment or professional athletes that I've admired, I've never had any personal desire to meet them.
No.
Because I only want to know them in that way.
Yeah.
It would be like, if I had to go and meet Derek Jeter, yeah, of course I would do it, but I don't want to, because I just want to know him the way I want to know him. I don't want to know them as the flawed human beings they are. I want to know them through their work.
Yeah. No, definitely, that's a very good win. Like Russell Crowe, let's just know through his work. Some pretty good acting chops on him, we'll say. But
he's not missing anything as far as I know.
No. But as the film progresses, we see sort of more. It just kind of we see more gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum, more sort of scheming, and there's that dude with the amazing eyebrows. And we just need to mention,
and they're real.
Are they real? Bloody hell!
Apparently they're real.
Wowzers,
they're real.
You did some research into the eyebrows.
Yeah, I was surprised how I came across that one. Something that's interesting about Maximus at this point, especially after he gets back to Rome, it starts in North Africa.
Yeah.
But after that initial confrontation with Commodus on the Colosseum floor, is that you begin seeing him being given his life back piece by piece.
Yeah, like he quickly becomes beloved by the crowd in the same way he was beloved by his troops. Like he's a very likable character, Maximus, and no matter if it is his soldiers or just spectators.
Or the gladiators around him.
Oh, yeah, of course, they have a gladiator.
They have
themselves.
such deference and respect towards him.
Well, in a later battle, he organized them. He goes back into military mode.
It was in the first battle.
Is it in the first battle? My apologies. So I was thinking the first Colosseum battle even, yeah.
Yeah, when apparently they're trying to reenact the Battle of Carthage.
Yes,
which apparently wasn't even the battle that actually was supposed to be.
So the Punic War, the Second Punic War, is something I did study even before AD history. It's a best of BC, that's for sure, Paul. Carthage, the Second Punic War is really interesting because Rome came so close to losing it all, and we don't exactly know why. But when Hannibal got to Rome, we don't know why he just never was able to fully conquer Rome itself. But he was at Rome's doorstep, and he just turned around for some unknown reason. So,
when it comes to Hannibal, there's a reason why people are still studying the Battle of Cannae, despite the fact that apparently they haven't been able to pinpoint the exact location of that battle.
No,
but whatever the case is, of course, under Maximus's direction and leadership through example and engendering that loyalty from the gladiators around him, they turn the tables on the whole thing for something that was supposed to be an outright slaughter to an unexpected victory. And not just an unexpected one where they eke it out either.
No.
All right. They curb stopped them.
And something I found interesting about this was their female archers. I thought that was quite cool. I don't know if that was just a directive choice or if that was historically accurate. But in this reenactment,
that I don't know, but I'm guessing it's probably artistic in nature if I were to guess.
But I thought that was interesting. And
sure.
It's here we get perhaps one of the most famous things, and this is another great example of what moviegoers expect of Rome compared to the historically accurate Rome. And this is the classic thumbs up, thumbs down from the emperor. So,
yeah, this is a big one.
Thumbs up meant die in reality, didn't it? If it didn't even happen at all,
or just straight out, which means stick the sword in them, kind of thing.
And here, thumbs up means they get to live, as we see Commodus give the thumbs up,
and that's entirely for the benefit of the modern audience.
Yeah, and it's
or if they approve, they kind of stick the thumb under one of the forefingers, something like that. The point is, the way it was done in the movie was very much so the modern audience could understand what was happening.
Mm.
The historical accuracy was one of those things would have been an impediment to the modern audience understanding.
And we also, if memory serves, the people seem to quite like Commodus during all of this. And was he popular with the plebs at the time? Do you know?
That's a difficult. I'm not 100% sure.
Hmm.
I mean, over time, I would imagine his popularity probably began to wane a little bit because Rome was definitely getting into some choppy waters. But, in terms of spectacle, there's a reason why, in this case, the progenitor of the Flavian dynasty was all about bread and circuses.
Yep. And
this Commodus certainly understands that part.
Commodus was perhaps the most bread and circuses emperor we'd had to date at this point.
With the exception maybe of Vespasian,
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But this film, as you said, Ridley Scott likes this show, Don't Tell. He literally shows us Rome throwing bread to the people. There's literally a scene where just for a battle, huge chunks of bread are being thrown into the crowd. Like,
yeah,
it's fascinating, and it really is it's literally actual bread and circuses. It hammers home that point quite significantly, but that's how you keep the people happy, keep them fed, keep them entertained. They'll stay on your side more or less.
And you have to imagine, this is true of any sport, any fans of any particular team. They often refer to the crowd in this, or even Rome in general in terms of its people, as the mob. And it's amazing how it's portrayed here, which is that you will succeed, you will live, so long as the mob is on your side. And this obviously is something that becomes very deeply troubling to Commodus, where it's becoming, at least in his eyes, fairly clear that the crowd seems to love Maximus, adore Maximus, more than they care in the least about him. And in fact, his sister Lucilla at one point in the movie, I forget who she was saying it to, I think it was to Maximus. She was talking about his bitterness. His bitterness coming from the fact that Marcus Aurelius loved this fictional Maximus more than he loved his own son. His daughter Lucilla once was in love with him, and now, of course, though I don't necessarily know that she mentions this outright in this little portion of it, but now the crowd seems to as well. And it's just one very intense emotional dagger after the other to Commodus, who really comes off, and Joaquin Phoenix is brilliant at doing this. There's no one who does it better, portraying that the character whose mental and cognitive state is fraying very clearly before actually outright losing it. There's not many times when you see, in this case, Joaquin Phoenix as Commodus loses top. And this is something that's actually really interesting. And it's a very good point of acting and directing. There's something that Laurence Olivier used to say about acting, which is never show the audience your top. Because once you do, you no longer have anywhere else to go. You always want that in your back pocket. You always want that available to you. So that in the one time that for whatever reason it is necessary to deviate and to show them your top, they will be utterly floored by it.
This was Joaquin Phoenix's top, do you reckon?
Yes, because he's fraying. And they keep him contained so that any time that there is a serious outburst, it hits a lot harder.
And I must admit, I haven't seen this film, but from your description, from what I've heard about this other film, you can understand why he was chosen to play the Joker.
Yes, absolutely.
I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard good things, and it sounds very reminiscent from what I've heard. But he's a very good actor. I need to watch not the Man in Black, Walk the Line again, because he's great in that as well. He
plays such a good Johnny Cash, and I love Johnny Cash. Funny aside, because we can do this here. And just funny little aside, very quickly. So I saw Walk the Line in theaters, and I saw it with a friend of mine who clearly she didn't know anything about Johnny Cash. And in that particular situation, maybe 20 minutes in, she's like, "Can we leave?" And I just look over to her and I whisper, enjoy the walk home.
Yeah.
Enjoy the walk home. No.
No, she stayed stuck
That
around.
that was just my way of saying there ain't no way in hell.
Yeah, that you're leaving.
Nope. And I'm the one with the keys in the car.
But no, Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor. Really good at stuff. He's really great in Her as well. Another great film where it's like mental stability is on the line. But let's get back to the thing at hand here. And we see more of what the Colosseum has to offer, because the Colosseum, it really is almost a character unto itself in this movie. A lot of it takes place within the Colosseum. Good point, yeah. And we see things like its trapdoors. If you look at the Colosseum to this day, the actual floor is gone, but you can kind of see those sort of underparts of it where the trapdoors were. And we also see tigers. And did Rome have tigers?
They had all sorts of exotic animals that they would come in. So,
I'm just thinking from where tigers are from. Tigers are very much of the subcontinent. Like
that's certainly true today. They used to be much more widely spread out prior to hunting and of course, human development. So here's something interesting.
I didn't know if tigers hit their areas, but yeah.
Yeah, so in the case of Commodus, we actually talked about this in that episode, basically, about Commodus and his real ability. And when he chose to be a gladiator, one of the big things that he would do in the arena was kill exotic animals. In fact, in that episode, Commodus on the Couch, back from about the middle of our second season, which was only about 10 months ago, but is that I actually gave a list of all of the various exotic animals that he brought in, like even, I think it was during even one set of games that he ended up slaughtering. And the list is truly ridiculous, to say the least. So in this case, is it plausible? Sure. I would have to say so based on just the fact that they would bring them in from all over the place and they would pay, a pretty coin to make that possible. So he would go and he would kill them in addition to actual gladiatorial combat, where he usually, if I understand my research correctly, in the case of gladiators, they had certain roles, like not just any gladiator can fight just any gladiator. So apparently the role, and this is according, this is according to Rihanna Evans from La Trobe University. If you haven't heard the podcast Emperors of Rome, believe me, it is a treat waiting to happen. It's so enjoyable, and it's one of the sources that I use to look into this because I just know how good they are at what they do. So I want to give credit where credit is due here. So apparently there's a few types. There was one that is considered the pursuer, which is usually apparently the role in terms of actual gladiatorial combat against other gladiators that Commodus preferred to have. And then you had another one that was called like a netman. So I think there are others, but those are the two that I remember mentioning. So yeah, he killed exotic animals, and he usually played the role of the pursuer gladiator as well, which I think is interesting. Yeah. And when they were shooting this particular scene, obviously these are trained tigers. This is what they do, for better or worse, however one might feel about that. They're trained, but they were assiduous in making sure that the tigers got no closer than 15 feet to Russell Crowe. And apparently there was a vet on site right there, just on the actual set, that was prepared with tranquilizer darts should things go awry.
So that's interesting, because I remember watching this. I remember one of the tigers looking particularly green screened at one point. I wonder if that's because he wasn't allowed that close to Russell Crowe. How interesting. I thought you were going to say they have a vet on site in case Russell Crowe starts acting up. They've got a tranquilizer to knock Russell Crowe out in case he gets too annoying.
Yeah, either him or Joaquin Phoenix. And the other thing that's really interesting to note here is actually Russell Crowe himself in doing these scenes. Apparently, he had some really bad injuries.
Oh, interesting.
Due to this. Yeah,
that makes sense.
He re-aggravated an old Achilles injury. He had a couple of issues with tendons in his biceps. They chipped his hip. He definitely took a very harsh physical toll in order to portray this role, and specifically the most physically demanding duties that it would require. And I'm sure they did some stunt double work because you got to protect your big people, but apparently he did enough of it to actually sustain physical injuries on numerous fronts on numerous occasions.
Gosh, well, that shows commitment to the role. And this is something we see like a lot of actors. It's easy to mock actors, but like a lot of them do like to get very physical with their roles. I think like in the Lord of the Rings, in the Lord of the Rings films, I think there was all kinds of bumps and scrapes and broken bones from those. So I know Viggo Mortensen broke his toe in one scene, but yeah.
Also, I think Tom Cruise also does most, if not all.
Oh
of his
yeah,
stunts.
Tom Cruise is a maniac though. He's gonna live forever, Paul, so he doesn't count.
This we know.
Yeah,
this we know.
He's gonna live forever anyway. So like, we got to think about the world we're leaving behind for Tom Cruise and all of this, Paul. But
undoubtedly.
But as the film progresses, we finally get to this sort of big climax. If you don't mind me reaching towards the end of the film, Paul.
Not at all.
And this is very much like hints of a Baroque emperor, and like the Baroque emperors were not going to be around for another 100 years or so during the 3rd century. But it's this kind of Maximus does fit that kind of bill of being a Baroque emperor. Like, people love him, they want him to rule. There's very much parallels between those two there, and with this sort of rebellion taking place, you kind of see hints of that. Although this isn't the time in history we'll start seeing emperors appear like that.
No, and one of the ways they kind of hint at that is actually early on, shortly before Marcus Aurelius is murdered by Commodus, when he encounters a couple of the more prominent Roman senators that happen to be up there near the front, and they said to him, you know, what are your plans going forward? And he just basically says, I just want to go back to my farm. And one of the senators say, oh, well, you know, with an army this size and this loyal to you, you could become very political. You remember that scene?
Yeah, I do remember. And that, once again, that's so Baroque's emperor of him. Like, this is something we wouldn't be seeing until the crust of the 1st century really started to unravel.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you had that idea here. We don't know if that actually historically happened, but like I said, Maximus was inspired by so many different characters, real figures from Rome's history, and just people like, I mean, wasn't the first Baroque emperor called Maximinus? Yeah, even similar in name. Yeah,
Maximinus Thrax.
Yeah, like an actual, like a literal commander who got support from his troops and was declared emperor. I'm sure people, if Commodus knew what was to come, not Commodus, I'm sure if the people of Rome knew what was to come with Commodus, they would be more inclined to declare someone like Maximus their emperor. And he does get in touch with his troops once again towards the end of the film, and they are fully in support with him.
It is. And it's interesting because you did mention this before, and I remember in rewatching this film, now knowing a lot more about this history, is the whole Cincinnatus concept. And the reason why, within the context of the story, that Marcus Aurelius would task him with this, which is to say that he's not a man of political ambition. He's a man that is there to serve. But even though his loyalty is to Rome, his heart is back on his farm, making him the ideal person to, you know, give Rome back to the people and the Senate and make it a republican again, which once again, as we mentioned before, is total bollocks.
Yeah, and do you mind me skipping towards the end here, Paul?
No, give us the climax.
So this film ends with Maximus killing Commodus on hand-to-hand combat, and I was shocked by this. We know Commodus was actually murdered
by his wrestling coach after they tried to poison him first. Of course, his wrestling coach was named Narcissus. And I remember the quip you mentioned at the time that Commodus was assassinated by his own narcissism.
Hey, yes.
That's a Patrick Foot original right there.
I'm very proud of past Patrick right there. That's some good stuff I said in the past. Well done, past Patrick. But like, and as I said, so this film, so shortly after killing Commodus, Maximus realizes my job is done here, and he goes to the farm like all good pet dogs do. He returns to the farm. But it kind of ends with Derek Jacobi's character, Gracchus, taking the helm again. And I was just shocked by this ending because, as I said, it basically ends on the inclination that Rome is going to go back to being a republic. that's kind of where this film that's where this film ends up. That just obviously isn't the case. And like I said, this is an alternate history film, Paul. I genuinely believe this should be held in the ranks of films like The Man in High Castle.
I mean, it's truly, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's alternate history. It's historical fiction.
It's even more than historical. As I mentioned, so I see historical fiction as being like, historical fiction is fictional events that happened over real events, but this is changing those real events. Like, this is huge impact on what's going to happen to Rome in the future. This completely changes what happens to Rome down the line. It's bonkers.
It's totally ridiculous. And the thing is, and this is not hard to understand or even all told really that big of an issue, but of course most of the public who has ever seen this movie would have no idea that this was not the case. And so this kind of gets to a moment that we kind of talked about a little last time when we were talking about the death of Stalin. If you know the history, or in some form or another history is your business, these kind of movies can be incredibly difficult to watch.
Yeah, and especially for us, we've literally just we've gone through this period of history
in such detail.
Yeah, with a toothpick, like, and it screams at you. But conversely, there's probably historical films I've watched and not even batted an eyelid to because I didn't know the history behind them. And part of the fun of these AD history watches is being stuffy historians, being like, well, actually, that didn't happen. But
yeah,
that's part of the fun with these we're watching films like this.
I agree. And one of the things that's interesting, though, that at least that's the way I've kind of become thinking about it, and certainly best in practice relative to what we're doing here on AD history. You know, the truth of the matter is, one of the great parts about this, despite the historical anachronisms, is that it's also remarkably teachable because it gives you so much to dig into and say, okay, yeah, here, oh yeah, da. You get the idea. There's so much to be learned from it that it's very teachable, I would say. But I do want to take a quick break here because we'll get more into our greater thoughts on the movie. But real quick, we're going to take a quick breather, and us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from one, Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick.
So I would say I do enjoy this film. If I'm going purely from a non-historical perspective, just as a moviegoer, it's a fun enough film. I definitely think it probably had a lot more gravitas to it when it first released in 2000. Seeing it now for the first time in 2021, we've seen much more spectacle from cinema since then. But even in the years that follow, Lord of the Rings, like as I mentioned, that blew this out of the water in epic and scale. But like I said, it really is the definitive Roman film. I think to a lot of people, it hits all those classic tropes of what you'd expect a film set in ancient Rome to have. But what are your thoughts on this film, just purely from a cinematic point of view?
So for millennials in particular, I think this is kind of one of the definitive Roman films in a way that something like, say, Spartacus or The Fall of Rome could never be, just given when they were released. So purely as a film, are there a few like little plot holes here? Yes. Are there definitely some times when you ask yourself, why is something this way? Well, because the plot needed it to be this way. That's fine. I would say just as a film, and the kind of film that it is, it gets a lot more right than it gets wrong.
Yeah.
Like I said, definitely show, don't tell. Keeping Maximus and how much dialogue he actually has being rather constrained is also another very good choice. The acting from everybody is superb.
Mm.
And it's also a story where the protagonist is incredibly sympathetic. If you're the audience, you cannot help but root for Maximus. Even his name, Maximus.
Yeah. It's the quintessential Roman name, isn't it, Maximus? Or at least it's become that thanks to this film.
As far as I know, there have been some oddities in the naming convention, but for an English-speaking audience at the dawn of the 21st century, you can recognize that it's Latin, and that, you know, the clear proximity to the word maximum kind of tells you everything you need to know to the modern audience. Now, of course, some of the CG now comes off as very PS2. We know, we get that, though it is important to remember that it was very good at the time. Yeah, and the more you learn about the film, you realize they did take a lot of effort to also include practical effects. This wasn't just all of them sitting in front a blue or a green screen, and that's nice.
It's not the Phantom Menace.
It is. No, definitely not. Or a lot of other stuff that's done that way today for the most part.
Oh, good, yes.
I love location shooting. I love practical effects. And obviously, like I said, the quality of the direction and the quality of the acting are just truly incredible. And it draws you in. You know, you don't really need to know that much to be compelled by the story.
No.
You just kind of need some kind of vague convention of what Rome might have been like at the time. Now, when you're in the history part of it, as we have learned so often, that these films can be very difficult to watch. And the next time we do 80 History Watches, and might I add here just real quick, that if you have a really good suggestion for the next time or upcoming 80 History Watches episodes, if you're on YouTube, definitely leave it in the comments. We want to see what else you have in mind. Back when we did the death of Stalin, there were definitely some people who gave some really quality ones as well. And we saw that. We know who you are. We know what you suggested. Or if you're not on the YouTube side of things and you're just listening to this audio only on one of the podcast apps or pod catchers of your choice, email them to us, which of course is 80historypodcast@tgnreview.com. Once again, that's 80historypodcast@tgnreview.com, because that's something that when we see a good suggestion is definitely going into the repository, definitely going into the watch list. And that's something we want to make sure that you listening to us, wherever you may be listening or watching us, as the case may be now, are fully aware of, because we always love hearing from you. So in this case, you know, it's interesting because obviously we've done a lot on Rome. We know a lot about it. Even still, this is easier for me to watch, despite its inaccuracies, than some elements of what we're going to probably be doing the next time we do 80 History Watches, which of course is The Imitation Game.
Yeah, I know you have a lot of issues with that film. And it's history I don't actually know as well as I do the history of Gladiators. That'd be quite interesting to have a look into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go over the top there. Obviously, it hits in some more important truths in general, specifically regarding Alan Turing and everything that went with that, if you're familiar with the story, which we'll leave to another time. But I remember I saw a historian that I adore. He did a little thing for, maybe it was Time, I don't remember entirely what it was, or maybe it was Wired, where his name is James Holland. He's both a historical author and historian, specifically the Second World War. Very good writer, very good research, very charming, charismatic guy. And they showed him 5 different historical World War II films. And when he got to The Imitation Game, because he was rating their accuracy at a scale of 1 to 10, when he got to The Imitation Game, he gave it 1 out of 10. For reasons that we'll talk about at another time. But that's more of a historical inaccuracy thing. And in this case, there are so many. But if you really want to keep your sanity and just enjoy yourself for 2.5 hours and shut that part of your brain off, Gladiator does that experience better than just about anything that you can imagine. It's very compelling on a human level in terms of the human story.
I think that's a great way to end this, Paula. That's a great way to sum it up. If you do turn off that actually part of your brain and just want to enjoy a movie, Gladiator is a really good shot for that. It really does feel that. Yeah, it's just a great proper movie, if that sounds strange. It's just it reminds you of that sort of golden age of Hollywood style epic. It's just a real throwback to that sort of thing. It's just a good solid flick, really. if you ignore the history.
It definitely is at that, which is great because it does offer so much. And I try not to let that get in the way of my enjoying it, unless something is, just so overwhelmingly egregious in many ways. For me, this is where the line sits, Patrick, is you have something like The Life of Brian or The Death of Stalin. And neither of those are purporting to be serious in any way, even though they both, surround very serious things, to be sure, in their own way. The issue I have is when I get to movies that are deadly serious.
And this is a deadly serious film.
Yeah. And there's no real tip to the audience that this is just a story. This is just a story. This is not the history lesson that you are looking for, to say the least. In this case, I don't necessarily think they're trying to do that by any means, but at the same time, that's really where things kind of make me a little nutty. But when you put that aside, because who wants to be a dick like that for 2.5 hours? That's just not any fun. And there are a number of reasons why movies are made the way they are, why sometimes when you're trying to adapt a really popular book to film, that there's something that just can't translate. And you have to make creative choices, you have to leave things out, you have to put new stuff in. Totally get that. But on its own merits, just as like a popcorn epic, Gladiator is among some of the best because it definitely knows how to play your emotions and it knows how to elicit the emotions it desires.
Yeah. So I will say thank you to Ridley Scott. Thank you to Russell Crowe. And something we forgot to mention, thank you to Hans Zimmer and Joaquin Phoenix. And
yes, Hans Zimmer did a fantastic job with the score.
Yeah, fantastic score. That's something I've got on my notes. I forgot to mention. Big thank you to Hans Zimmer as well. No, thank you for this film. It's wrong in all the wrong places, but right in all the right places.
It all depends, I suppose, on why you are sitting down to watch it in the first place. So, us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from one. Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT. And of course on YouTube, search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, The World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II related questions, which if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? Drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.